I am going to be diving into what was once Australia's second largest airline, a crucial player in the development of commercial aviation in Australia, which slowly struggled to maintain its grip in Australian aviation over time, ultimately falling in what is still to this day Australia's single largest business failure. Today I will be exploring the former Ansett Airlines. Ansett Airways was initially founded by Reginald Ansett in 1935. This was originally an offshoot of a successful road transport business which had threatened the viability of rail transport. This led the state government to legislate to put private road transport operators such as Ansett out of business. Ansett countered by establishing an airline as aviation was under control of the federal government and beyond the reach of the state government. Ansett's first route between Hamilton and Melbourne, operated by a 6-seater Fokker Universal monoplane, commenced on 17th of February 1936. The early days of the airline were characterised by moderate success. Eventually, within a few months, a second plane was added, before Ansett floated his airline on the Melbourne Stock Exchange in April 1937. As the route network expanded, Ansett Airways imported Lockheed Electra aircraft from the UK to expand its fleet. During World War II, Ansett suspended all of its scheduled services, except for the Hamilton service, in favour of more profitable work for the United States Army Air Forces. The Ansett organisation finished the war flush with cash, but faced trouble trying to regain its airline routes, which had been taken over by Australian National Airways, its main competitor at the time. Ansett had obtained war surplus Douglas DC-3s to expand its fleet. At the same time, however, Ansett was faced with a new competitor, the government-owned Trans-Australia Airlines. Ansett was an innovator as it was the first Australian airline to move into the package holiday business. In 1947, Ansett started offering services to resorts in the Great Barrier Reef using Catalina flying boats. These services established the Great Barrier Reef as a destination for tourists. Ansett developed Hayman Island into a major holiday resort in the Whitsunday region. In the 1950s, Ansett continued to expand modestly as Australian National Airways and Trans-Australia Airlines battled for supremacy. Ansett operated around the Big Two, maintaining budget fare interstate operations with DC-3s and later Convair CV-340s. In 1957, the company offered to buy out Australian National Airways. The company directors fiercely resisted this initially, but in October 1957 succumbed to Ansett's offer of £3.3 million for their airline. Australian National Airways was absorbed into Ansett, with a new entity being called Ansett-ANA. Ansett enjoyed substantial profits primarily due to the airline being in a duopoly with Trans-Australia Airlines. This was due to the Menzies government's two airlines policy, an incredibly strict regulation, blocking any other domestic interstate operators apart from Ansett and TAA, by way of a ban on importation of aircraft without a government licence. From 1957 until the 1980s, under the strict rules set down by the two airlines policy, Ansett and TAA operated as virtual carbon copies of each other, operating the same aircraft at the same times, to the same destinations, at identical government-imposed fares. In 1964, Ansett entered the jet age with a Boeing 727 aircraft. It was the first Australian domestic airline to operate jet aircraft, having won a coin toss with Trans-Australia Airlines to be the first to operate the 727.
Tell me, sir, why did Ansett ANA specifically select the 727 as a Viscount replacement?
Well, it's not a Viscount replacement. It's the jet age now, and it's the best jet for this type for inside Australia, the best jet in the world, and it's as fast as anything in the world. So it's the best, and it's just good enough for Australia.
Throughout the 60s, Ansett continued to expand. The newly acquired jet aircraft made flights between major cities slightly cheaper. Ansett also continued to expand its services in regional areas with the acquisition of smaller regional carriers. On the 1st of November 1968, Ansett-ANA was renamed to Ansett Airlines of Australia. By 1969, Ansett had become Australia's leading domestic airline, and its market share would reach a peak of 55%. In the early 1970s, larger companies began to take interest in Ansett. In 1972, transport giant TNT was starting to show its interest in the growing airline. It launched a failed takeover attempt of Ansett, which was blocked by the Victorian government. However, in spite of this, TNT still wanted their hands on Ansett. Also in the early 1970s, international travel was seriously affected by the 1973 oil crisis. The price of oil would double globally. However, unlike many other airlines of its day, Ansett did not feel the sting as bad as the others. Remember how I said TNT still wanted to get their hands on Ansett? Well, in 1979, Reginald Ansett finally lost control of his company to a consortium led by TNT and Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, with TNT taking operational control over the airline. The airline continued to prosper in the 1980s thanks to the two airlines policy that effectively guaranteed the airline would make money. In 1984, Ansett made headlines after it controversially banned HIV-positive individuals from travelling on their planes to protect their staff members. The Australian Flight Attendants Association ultimately rejected these bans. During this time, Ansett was also particularly trigger-happy with its cash, with questionable aircraft purchasing decisions. Ansett went about totally overhauling its jet aircraft fleet, with the acquisition of Australia's first domestic wide-body aircraft in Boeing 767-200s. Due to union demands, Ansett's initial order for 8 767-200s were the only 3 crew 767s ever built, requiring a flight engineer to operate them. They were also the second airline to operate the Airbus A320 after Air France, ordering an initial 12 of them, and Ansett ordered more 727s and introduced 737s to the fleet. These huge aircraft orders greatly contributed to Ansett's Noah's Ark fleet, but this will be touched on a bit later. A number of substantial non-aircraft investments made by Ansett performed badly, including a share in the US airline America West Airlines, and its Hamilton Island resorts. The financial position of the company was made significantly less stable after huge expenditure in the 1980s. Further down the line, Ansett would also go on to pay millions of dollars for the right to be the official airline of the Sydney 2000 Olympics. Ansett expanded into New Zealand in 1987 through its subsidiary Ansett New Zealand, after the government of New Zealand opened its skies to the airline. Its New Zealand division started out with a few regional jets and Boeing 737-100s, but didn't expand much further from that. In the early 90s, Ansett's main protection, the two airlines policy, was finally abolished.
For nearly 40 years, the way Australians have flown has been strictly controlled by government regulation. Where you flew, when you flew, and how much you paid to fly. Now, with deregulation, the shackles are off.
Now the airline had to engage in competition with Australian airlines through market-based pricing. In less than a few months, the price of airfares from major cities in Australia would sharply decrease. Its profits were also subject to new competitors entering the airline industry. In 1992, Australian Airlines was bought off the government by Qantas, creating a mega airline that allowed Qantas to operate domestic services for the first time. Briefly, another competitor, Compass Airlines, tried to enter the market, but to no avail. To better compete with its new rival, Ansett sought to expand beyond domestic aviation. International flights commenced in September 1993 to Bali. Ansett's international services saw the introduction of the Boeing 747 to the fleet for the first time. Eventually, Ansett would expand to 8 different international destinations in Asia. In the mid-1990s, New Zealand national carrier Air New Zealand became hungry to expand its sphere of influence across the Tasman. This was due to government regulations forbidding the carrier from operating domestically in Australia. Seeing the new opportunity arising, Air New Zealand attempted to acquire a share of Qantas when it was initially privatised in 1995, but it wasn't able to purchase Qantas shares. Instead, it bought TNT's 50% stake in Ansett Australia for $540 million in 1996, though managerial control remained in the hands of News Corporation. Singapore Airlines was also interested in buying out Ansett as it wanted to expand further in the Asia Pacific region. Following the sale to Air New Zealand, Ansett had to quickly divest itself of Ansett New Zealand to avoid creating a monopoly. In March 1999, Ansett and Air New Zealand became full Star Alliance members. 1999 also saw the start of disputes over ownership of Ansett. Ansett remained profitable, but was having increasing difficulty in finding a way to rationalise its cost structure, and seriously needed a capital injection to replace its aging fleet. Of the two half owners, News Corporation was more interested in selling out and investing the proceeds in other industries, while Air New Zealand did not have the funds to spare, as Ansett's need for capital was greater than Air New Zealand's ability to provide it. Singapore Airlines and Qantas expressed an interest in buying Air New Zealand. Ansett employees were planning a staff buyout, and both Singapore Airlines and Air New Zealand looked at buying News Limited's 50% share of Ansett. In March 1999, Singapore made a formal offer of $500 million for a half share. Given the carrier's industry-leading status, ability to fund Ansett's re-equipment and expansion, and global marketing network, industry observers were enthusiastic about the move. However, as part of its original deal to buy TNT's half of Ansett, Air New Zealand had a preemptive right to News Limited's half, provided only that it matched or bettered other offers. The Air New Zealand board initially approved the sale to Singapore, but negotiations stalled when major Air New Zealand shareholder Brierley Investments began buying more Air New Zealand shares and attempting to get Singapore to buy Ansett through either Air New Zealand or Brierley, rather than from News Limited. Eventually, the sale to Singapore Airlines was rejected by News in July 1999. At this stage, Ansett announced an unexpectedly high profit for the year, $149 million, and News Corporation took advantage of that to raise the asking price to $1 billion. Industry analysts regarded this as far too optimistic and put the true value of a half share at no more than $700 million. In February 2000, a decision was finally made. Air New Zealand would buy the remaining half of Ansett previously owned by News Corporation for $680 million. Industry observers were united in the belief that it was a bad decision. The price was higher than the true value of the Ansett shares, and Air New Zealand, being a smaller airline than Ansett, would not be able to fund the badly needed re-equipment. Monash University aviation economics academic Keith Trace commented, "By taking it on, they ensured that their own airline was in terrible danger. That was a dreadful mistake. They were taken for a ride." Over the next 18 months, Ansett entered what would be an unrecoverable stall in the business world. 2000 marked the entrance of new competitors, the regional-focused Impulse Airlines, and a brand new Virgin carrier, Virgin Blue. While these two competitors were initially fledgling smaller carriers, Virgin's low-cost model allowed it to quickly grow and began to bite into the ailing Ansett's market share. To make matters worse, the Australian government had grounded Ansett's aging Boeing 767-200 fleet in Easter 2001 due to Ansett's perceived lack of ability to maintain these old aircraft. These aircraft were crucial in their domestic operations in the Golden Triangle between Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. Ansett was thus unable to compete with the low-cost carriers in Qantas, who were able to run at a loss in some routes. This was because they could not maintain revenue while cutting their costs, which included laying off staff. By that point, doing such a thing was like rearranging chairs on the Titanic. All this left Ansett seriously short of cash, and by 2001, they were losing $1.3 million a day. Air New Zealand attempted to cut Ansett's costs, while maintaining the same level of revenue. This did not work, as the cost cutting hurt Ansett. Ultimately, the end was in sight. Quickly running out of cash and options, and keen to wash their hands of Ansett, Air New Zealand placed the Ansett group of companies into voluntary administration on the 12th of September 2001. In the early hours of 14 September, the administrators determined that Ansett was not viable to continue operations, and grounded the fleets of Ansett and its subsidiaries Hazelton Airlines, Candle, Skywest and Aeropelican. This would become Australia's largest corporate failure. Flights already in the air at the time the decision was made continued on to their destinations, most unaware of the devastating news that would greet them at the other end. Few customers and employees had any warning of a stoppage in operations. Everyone had been told in the days leading up to the 14th of September that flights would continue on schedule, and most Ansett employees did not find out until they showed up for work at dawn that day. Thousands of passengers were left stranded, and more than 16,000 people found themselves out of a job, making this the largest mass job loss event in Australian history. Widespread protests were held by workers on the day. After receiving a federal government guarantee, Ansett resumed limited services between major cities on the 1st of October 2001, utilising only the Airbus A320 fleet. This was referred to as Ansett Mark II, an operation run and financed by Ansett Australia under administration. The purpose of getting Ansett back into the air was aimed directly at attracting a buyer for the business and generating positive cash flow. The scaled-back operation ran on a very tight budget, and its product reflective of that, being an all-economy setup with no catering or frequent flyer services. Ansett was essentially in powered down mode, while the administrators tried to source buyers. In November 2001, Ansett creditors voted to allow the Tesla Consortium, led by Melbourne businessmen Solomon Lew and Lindsay Fox, to purchase Ansett's mainline assets. The plan involved creating a new Ansett. It would be a full-service, two-class, single-fleet type domestic airline. It included very reduced staff numbers and an all-new Airbus A320 fleet. The new Ansett would operate out of the old Ansett terminals, and temporarily lease the former Ansett's A320 fleet until newer replacements arrived. Loyalty products such as the Golden Wing Club and Frequent Flyer program would be relaunched. These plans were well advanced. A new CEO was sourced and hired and began to put together a new management team. A new head office was planned. A new catering company was selected, with new business and economy class in-flight meals trialled on passengers on select Mark II services in readiness for the new operation. However, the agreement with Ansett's administrators collapsed in late February 2002. Without any prior warning, the administrators announced on 27 February that Tesla had withdrawn their bid. A subsequent press conference with Fox and Lew the same day announced that they had received no financial support from the government for their bid, thus withdrawing their proposal. With any ability to revive Ansett now gone, the administrators were ultimately forced to pull the plug, ceasing all flying operations on the 4th of March 2002. With the very last commercial flight, Ansett Flight 152 from Perth to Sydney, touching down at 6:53 AM on 5th of March. Ansett was then left completely abandoned.
Ansett's last passenger flight touched down in Sydney just minutes ago. Flight AN 152 arrived at Kingsford Smith Airport from Perth, with passengers and crew sharing the disappointment.
Day for all of us, for all the staff at Ansett. It's an end of an era, an end of a great company, great Australian company, and the staff now are faced with uncertain future.
The collapse of the airline has cost 16,000 jobs. The final flight given an emotional send-off from the West Coast.
With Ansett now grounded for good, the administration began selling off Ansett's assets. This included its regional subsidiary airlines, which still continued to trade despite Ansett being grounded. A creditors meeting post-March 2002 voted in favour of an organised wind-up of the operation under a deed of company arrangement, as opposed to an immediate liquidation. However, this process would take just shy of a decade, as many of Ansett's assets had lost their value following September 11 crippling the global aviation industry, as it had the effect of reducing the value of aircraft from $300 million to just $70 million. Laid-off Ansett workers were eventually paid most of their entitlements, partially from a $150 million compensation package offered by Air New Zealand, but it was mostly achieved through asset sales and leasing revenue. The federal government did provide a $350 million loan to the administrators, which was paid off by taxpayers in the form of an airfare levy, in place until around 2009. Employees ended up receiving around 96% of their entitlements, with the process being completed in July 2011. In the months following the final flights, the administrators negotiated the sale of the terminal leases back to the airport owners, obtaining millions. Auctions were held to sell Ansett's airport furniture and equipment. Ansett's former headquarters in Melbourne was sold to PDG Corporation. The disposal of the former fleet did not progress quickly, given the depressed aviation market and the subsequent lack of demand by other carriers around the world whose operations had been crippled by the 9/11 attacks only months before. Following the final flight, nearly all the A320 fleet was ferried back empty to Melbourne, where they sat at abandoned gates in storage. The Airbus A320 and Boeing 737 fleets ultimately found new owners first, and departed Australia between March 2002 and December 2006, as the banks finally reclaimed them, or as new owners were found. The Boeing 767-300 aircraft was reclaimed by the lessors in the week following the collapse. The two Boeing 747s that were leased from Singapore Airlines were returned to the airline, where they were repainted and returned to service. They subsequently found new lines and were operated by Fiji's national carrier Fiji Airways, before being retired in 2013 and scrapped. With the newer aircraft gone, the older Boeing 767-200 fleet were placed into long-term storage at the Ansett engineering base until late 2004, where they were all ferried to the US to be scrapped. So, what happened? Ansett had a series of factors that led to its failure, accrued during its last 2 decades of operation. Ansett had a Noah's Ark of a fleet that was in desperate need of a replacement. This was directly related to their spending spree of new aircraft in the 1980s. They had too many different types of aircraft in their fleets, and operated a fleet that was too old. With an average fleet age of 12 years in 2001, Ansett had a substantially older fleet than Qantas. Ansett had not formulated plans to acquire new aircraft to replace their older ones, such as a new long-haul aircraft to inevitably replace their Boeing 747s, new Boeing 767-300s to replace the old ones, and new A320s or 737 next-generation aircraft. And when they did try to do this, it was too late. They were also one of very few airlines to operate both 737 Classic and A320 fleet in its short-haul fleet, which required a far more substantial number of pilots, due to each aircraft having a different type rating. The expenses on maintenance for both of these aircraft were much too unnecessary, as most airlines had stuck to operating one type of narrow-body aircraft by this time. Ansett, on the other hand, had not, and appeared committed to operating both of these aircraft models in the long term. Air New Zealand's full acquisition of Ansett was also an unwise decision, as it was attempting to fully buy out an airline that was larger than itself, let alone an airline that was quickly sinking. At the end of the day, it was a poorly thought out decision, which can be attributed to the carrier's desire to gain a foothold in Australian commercial aviation. Had Singapore Airlines bought Ansett, it might have been likely that Ansett continued operation to this day. Air New Zealand couldn't even get itself out of the Ansett collapse, being saved with a government bailout which kept the carrier out of sinking into a black hole. The ultimate final nail in the coffin was the September 11 attacks. While Ansett collapsed 2 days after this disaster broke the news, airlines around the world immediately felt the sting the attacks had on the global tourism and airline industry. Having this happen effectively sealed the deal for Ansett, and eliminated their chances of escaping administration, as demand for aviation quickly fell within days of these events. And that is the end of Ansett's 3/4 of a century of operations. Once a proud leading domestic carrier, became a name synonymous with failure and collapse. In spite of its missteps and its demise 18 years ago, Ansett's major role in the development of Australian domestic aviation and the legacy it holds on that industry cannot be understated. Hey guys, thanks for watching this video all the way to the end. If you are new to this channel and missed out on the last video, click on the thumbnail on this video or in the description below. If you like my content and want to see more, like, comment and hit that subscribe button down below.